Today is August 2nd, 2023, and my guest is oncologist and professor of epidemiology, Vinay Prasad of the University of California, San Francisco. This is Vinay's fourth appearance on EconTalk. He was last here in January of 2023 talking about the FDA and the death of duty. Vinay, welcome back.
Russ, such a pleasure to be here.
Our topic for today is screening for cancer. Screening seems like an unambiguously wonderful idea. The idea is to catch the cancer before it's manifested, when it's too late, when you happen to notice it in a very unpleasant way. And it seems like a great idea to catch it early, but it's complicated. Why? Why is it complicated?
It's something that everyone's interested in, and we've got a number of blood-based companies in this space, but it's also one of the most tricky things we do in medicine. And the short answer, Russ, is that when we talk about cancer, what we're typically talking about is what the pathologist tells us they found on a biopsy. So if somebody comes in with a lump in the breast and you biopsy it, or a polyp in the colon and you cut it out, and somewhere in that specimen they see that the cells are invading, that they're invading the basement membrane, they look cancerous. So it's sort of a histopathologic, means how it looks like on the slide. The challenge is, of course, that just because something looks like cancer doesn't mean we know what its behavior will be, how it will act in the future. And some of these lesions that we find are definitely the sort of lesions that are going to kill you. Some of the lesions are the sort of lesions that are going to kill you were it not for cutting it out in that moment. So if you catch it early and cut it out, now it's not going to kill you. Some of them, they're going to kill you regardless of whether or not you cut it out. It's already spread. The damage is already done. And then some of them are lesions that might not cause you harm in the rest of your natural life. And that's a very counterintuitive idea and something people call overdiagnosis. And the problem with screening is that it has to have the right balance of these things. You have to catch a lot of the cancers that if you didn't find it, it would have done something bad. But now that you found it, we have a good outcome. And not so much of the ones that they're going to do something bad anyway. That's just adding sort of extra time, anxiety to your life. And not so much of the ones that aren't going to do anything.
Now, related to this, of course, we'd like to know which of those kinds that the cancers are. But we have this thing called stages. Stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4. Aren't they a attempt to measure and quantify, not quantify, but rank or qualitatively assess the odds that it's going to be bad for you?
Yeah, you're right. Their stages are put forth by the American Cancer Society, and they are broadly used for a few purposes. One, to track cancer over time. Are we seeing an increase in a certain stage of cancer, an increase in a certain cancer? In the 20th century, we had a huge decline in gastric cancer, which we attribute to improvements in food transportation, refrigeration. We had a huge rise and fall in lung cancer, which we attribute to the rise and fall of smoking. So, these kinds of staging and cancer tracking systems are good for that. Staging is also a way to delineate how many people are presenting with just the lump in the breast, sort of a stage 1 cancer, and how many women are presenting each year with metastatic cancer, so breast cancer that's spread beyond the breast, a stage 4 cancer. You can track both of those over time. Now, you're absolutely right that stage and prognosis are tied together. And in fact, a stage 4 generally has a lower 5-year survival. Fewer people are alive at 5 years than stage 3 and stage 2, et cetera. But staging is not a perfect system. I mean, stage 4 disease is not 0% alive, and stage 1 is not 100%. There's, exceptions, and there are bad outcomes that happen in every stage. Let me just say it's a crude risk stratification. There's so many other risk stratification schemes beyond that, but this is a crude one.
Yeah, and it's actually what I said is not quite right. It's not so much an assessment of what the nature of these cells and how they're going to metastasize as more crude measures of where is it, right? And it's not just the size. The screening will often identify the size from a mammogram or other test, right?
Yeah, staging often includes things like size, depth of invasion. the number of places it's gone to, the specific places it's gone to, and if it's spread in distant sites. That's typically stage 4. The staging systems varies a lot by cancer. For instance, in testicle cancer, there's only 3 stages because the outcomes are so good. So there is no stage 4. In anaplastic thyroid cancer, it's so bad, there's only stage 4. It's always stage 4. There's no other stage. So you're absolutely right that it's often related to the places where the tumor has gone, although some staging systems use more complicated things like how it looks like on a fancy new scan called PET scan, or laboratory markers, or depth of invasion, how deep the tumor has invaded. These things all go into staging. And it's constantly being revised every few years.
So you have a powerful metaphor for helping us think about the complexity of detecting cancer. Cancer is obviously a very scary thing. It's so scary, we call it the C word sometimes. They don't want to actually say the word out loud. I don't know if that's a healthy cultural reaction. My first thought is probably not. I'd rather go the other direction. We're blessed to live in a time where we have better techniques than we had in the past for both screening and treatment. We'll talk about that. But you have a metaphor for how we think about this mix of kinds of cancer and their likely outcome on us.
Yeah, and I can't even take credit for the metaphor. The metaphor goes back quite some time, and I'm not sure people exactly know who came up with it. But the metaphor is a barnyard metaphor. And the metaphor is basically like, imagine you're a farmer and you have a barnyard and you have lots of different animals in your barnyard. And you want to find a way to keep the animals in your barnyard. And that's, I think, the idea of catching the animal before it leaves the barnyard is the metaphor for catching the cancer before it causes a problem. And one can imagine there's 3 types of animals in your barnyard. There are rabbits, turtles, and birds. The thing is, the fence, it's going to be really good at catching those rabbits. They are hopping, they're jumping, and when they get to the fence, they're going to be stopped and they're going to come right back to your yard. The turtles, actually, turns out you probably didn't even need the fence. They're moving so slowly that even in the next year or 2, they're not going to get outside your yard. This is how the metaphor goes. And the birds, meanwhile, are moving so quickly that no fence can stop them. They've already flown right out of your yard. And those are also cancers. So the idea is that the turtles, the birds, and the rabbits are all cancers. Some cancers are so aggressive that even when you screen people, they have already spread. And in fact, Russ, I would just say that when you look at all of the screening tests we're going to talk about today, and maybe the ones we're not going to talk about, one thing to point out to the listeners is that no screening test reduces death from that cancer to 0%. So we debate how well they work. We debate the benefits and harms, but nobody debates the fact that you can get all the colonoscopies you want, and there's still a risk of dying of colon cancer. You can get all the breast cancer screening you want. There's still a risk of dying of breast cancer. Typically, that risk is 80% of the risk. I mean, even the proponents think it only lowers cancer death by 20%. What that means is there's a lot of birds. There's a lot of birds. And then the other thing, Russ, is we should have some humility in medicine. We don't know how many turtles there are. And turtles matter a lot because every time you find a turtle, you're going to treat that person as if they had a rabbit or as if they had a bird. They're going to get the full court press of treatment, but they may not have needed much of that treatment or even any of that treatment. And so that's just harm being inflicted on someone. So this is the delicate balance of screening.
And coming back to your opening statement about we see cancer, but we don't always know how the nature of those cells and how they're going to spread. I assume there's a lot of people looking at how we might distinguish turtles, rabbits, and birds, because that's huge. We've talked a few times in the program about prostate cancer. My dad had it. I'm 68 years old. I might have it. I think many men, my understanding is that many men at the time of death have prostate cancer. It's just a turtle. And your heart attack or your stroke or your pancreatic cancer kills you before the prostate cancer does, but you have prostate cancer. Of course, tragically, there are prostate cancers that are rabbits, that if you don't detect them early, you're done. Others are birds. It's too late. So I assume we're trying to figure out ways to anticipate. I mean, another way to think about it is in other medical problems, sometimes taking a wait and see attitude is the right approach. The scary thing is if you wait too long, what you see is it's too late. So talk about that.
No, it's absolutely right. So you made many astute points. One point you made is that most men die with prostate cancer, not from prostate cancer. It's absolutely true. Autopsy studies have gone back for decades showing that, it's almost like every decile, that's the decile of prostate cancer. So 60-year-old men, 60% will have some prostate cancer on autopsy that didn't have anything to do with why they died. 80% of 80-year-old men, et cetera. It almost is at that level. Most men are going to have some of it, and it's not going to be a problem. Of course, there are some men who die terribly from prostate cancer, and we don't want that to happen. It's 2% of all male deaths. If there's anything we could do to try to lower that, we would want to do that. And that's where the screening idea comes in place. Now, you make a really excellent point, which is, aren't you trying to sort out what are the rabbits from the birds from the turtles? And yes, many people are. They're using things like, in prostate cancer, MRI. So can I conduct an MRI of the prostate, get a better sense of things? They're doing things like genomic analysis, proteomic analysis. But the one thing I would say about this whole space, Russ, is that in order to figure out a molecular test that distinguishes rabbits from birds from turtles, you need to link it to some gold standard. What is a rabbit? What is a bird and a turtle? And that takes, the only gold standard is time. So I guess the argument I want to make is that some of the research I'm critical of is that, yes, they're finding things that they think predict more aggressive behavior, but they really haven't answered the fundamental question, which is this the tumor that if I cut out, the person's going to be alive and well at 85, and if I don't, they'll be dead at 57? A number of people are investing in this space. One notable example is the Google AI, and they're training the artificial intelligence, Google image detection on mammography specimens to see, can we find more cancers? And in fact, they have a Nature paper that shows maybe they can find more cancers. But are they really finding more rabbits? And the answer is that you would need a gold standard way to tell me what's a rabbit from a turtle from a bird. And the gold standard way is to know that if this is the tumor I cut out, the person's going to live to 85. And if I didn't cut it out, they'll be dead by 57. Whereas if this is the tumor I cut out, so that's a rabbit. If I cut out this tumor, they're going to die at the age of 75 from leukemia either way. That's a turtle. Or if I cut out this tumor, they're going to die at 62 of breast cancer either way. And that's a bird. And to do that, you really need longitudinal data. You need data sets that have tracked these tumors over time. I'm not sure we have a lot of those data sets that are capable of this question. I think what it will take is prospective randomized studies. That's what I always like to say. And that's a challenge in the space, though. I think there's some knowledge challenges. But Russ, you're absolutely right. The holy grail is a blood test that tells you, you are the person. I know your future in two worlds, the world where I don't do something and the world where I do something. And that's the holy grail. What can we find that from your biopsy?
So let's turn to some of the specific things that we know about screenings of various kinds. And before we do that, we should say a couple of things, I think. And I'll say them, and then you can either assent or dissent. One is the bottom line of a lot of this, unfortunately, is going to be that screening is not as effective as we might hope. That certainly doesn't mean you shouldn't screen. A lot of these results that show little or no effect for certain types of screenings are for the average person, not for the person with the genetic proclivity, not with the cancer in their family of a certain kind. You can give us some insight into that. The other thing I want to mention is that I think in the background of our whole conversation, you're a doctor who cares about numbers a great deal. I'm an economist, and we pretend that we can be rational and objective and somewhat thoughtful in terms of what is fundamentally a risky and uncertain part of life, which is whether you're going to be killed by a cancer. And I think the overwhelming attitude of most human beings who are not economists or oncologists who care about data, the overwhelming attitude is, well, I'd rather know than not know, better safe than sorry, and I'd rather treat than not treat because I would get the thing out of me. The idea of saying, it's a turtle, don't worry about it, I think is very hard for both the patient and the family and loved ones of the patient. So talk about those two things. One, what kind of data are we looking at here for which kind of population? And secondly, psychological issues that are part of this, it's a reality.
Yeah. So I think you made many good points. One, this is not medical advice, so you should talk to your doctor. Two, you make a point that people often make, which is this is about average risk populations. And in fact, most of the data we're going to talk about, which comes from large randomized studies or population surveillance data, is for average risk populations. I always make the point that in some ways we've failed the high risk people because those are the people we should have been doing special trials in, but we haven't. And so we have a mantra in medicine. Well, if you're high risk and I don't have data, the answer's got to be more screening. But, I'm a little skeptical of that narrative. I'm not sure that that's the case. It could be that they have even more of the harms of screening. And unfortunately, they have more birds, maybe. And you're just fine, and you're not able to change the natural history. I guess there's two more things. Go ahead. I just want to say the psychology. The psychology part is, look, especially in the tech world where there's a lot of enthusiasm for screening, the psychology is information cannot be bad. All information is good. The only answer is how you use that information. Only a doctor will tell you that information can be terrible. Information can sometimes rot at you. It can change your behavior. It can be not useful information, but it can cloud your vision of yourself. You can go from thinking of yourself as a healthy person to a sick person, even though nothing has changed. And even though you're going to die of the same day at 75 in a car accident, for instance, that's something screening can do to you. You can end up getting chemotherapy. I mean, once you're told you have cancer, it's very difficult to say, okay, I'm just going to watch it. I think we've made progress in that space. We're doing a better job than we did 20 years ago. But it's still difficult. Imagine telling me you have prostate cancer and, we're not going to cut it out. We're just going to let it sit there and watch it. I'm like, oh my God, it sounds terrifying. What's it going to do? It can only do something bad. So that's a huge psychological barrier. The last thing I want to say is there are two more things we should introduce as concepts up front. One is this idea of competing risk. A colleague of mine always says that we forget with screening, but each individual screening test is at best going after, 1 to 4% of the things that kill you. In other words, most of what kills us is cardiovascular disease. I mean, that's the reality. And then you screen for breast cancer or prostate cancer, which is 2 to 3% of all deaths, or colon cancer, which is just a few percent. And so the first thing you should have is the humility to know that there's so many other things that could kill you that you're not even looking at in this moment. The next thing is competing risk is if I get a colon polyp found and you cut it out, but 2 years later I have leukemia and I die of leukemia 5 years later, what, did you benefit me? Maybe if that colon cancer would have caused a problem in those 7 years, but if not, you didn't benefit me. I mean, you just made me worried about my colon when that was really not what was going to get me in the end. And that's sort of a competing risk problem that really makes it difficult for cancer screening because they're typically done in older people who have a lot of competing risks. And then the last thing I want to introduce is, you said this really well. Our screening is better. It's able to find more things. Our treatment is better. One principle of screening has always been that screening tests work really well if there's a differential treatment effect. In other words, if you find it early and you treat it like a breast lump, you can get rid of it forever and the benefit is big. But if you find it late and it's already spread distantly, our drugs are very ineffective and there's not much we can do. And that difference in the treatment effect from early to late is what we're exploiting in a screening test. As one example, in testicle cancer, since the 70s and 80s, we can cure testicle cancer even when it's spread everywhere, like Lance Armstrong. Our cure rates are like 95, 6, 7% for metastatic testicle cancer. So actually, because we can cure it so well when it's advanced, there's no longer an impetus to find it early. And the USPSTF, the United States Preventive Services Task Force, says don't examine your testicles every month in the shower. It's USPSTF grade D because you're only going to find, incidental things that and lead to losing a testicle, which is the way we don't biopsy a testicle, we actually just remove it. And even if it presented late, you still have an excellent result. So there's no differential to exploit. And finally, the thing I'd say is our treatments are getting better for breast cancer, prostate cancer, et cetera, in the advanced disease, which many of us believe is eroding whatever benefit of screening was there in the first place.
So I'm going to mention two other things that are in the background of this conversation. One is, of course, there's no free lunch. A lot of people's attitude toward screening is, well, if you find it, first of all, people say, well, you don't have to treat it, which of course emotionally is very difficult. That's one of the examples you gave of of the information not always being helpful. But most people forget that in many cases there is downside risk both from the test and the treatment if it's a turtle. Or no matter what it is, actually, just the treatment itself is often you're going to be taking poison because you need to get rid of the cancer, and it's going to be poisoning other things as well. So this idea that tests are free because, worst case scenario, you don't find anything. No, that's not the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is you endured the test. The second part of it is you had a false positive. It said you had something that, in fact, you don't have. You start a treatment that has a destructive component, or, worse, not worse, but alongside with that, sometimes the test itself leads to damage. And, it's small. A friend of mine has a test coming up. And his doctor I asked him, I said, what are the risks of the test itself? He said, well, my doctor reassured me that it's only 1%. I can't remember what the numbers. Let's say 1% of the times that the scope pierces something it's not supposed to pierce. I said, well, I wouldn't be so interested in that national rate. I'd kind of want to know the rate of the doctor you're seeing, because he knows that number, and if it might be 5% for him, and that could be because he looks at harder people, difficult cases. A lot of reasons you have to take those data consume those data thoughtfully. But I just want to put that on the table. The second thing I want to put on the table is, and you and I are more aware of this, I think, than most people. Many doctors, almost all of them, are loving, caring people who get into the profession they're in because they want to cure and make people healthier. They also make money from these tests, or different people in the profession, in the industry, make money from these tests. And so there's an enormous machine encouraging these tests and it's a bootlegger and Baptist problem, meaning you feel good about yourself if you're pushing the test because screening is good. And of course you do benefit personally, but these two things work together. But it's actually a little more, it's not so healthy that there's an enormous personal and financial incentive in some of these situations. So talk about those two things.
Gosh, I mean, it's really well put, Russ, and I agree with everything you said. One, some screening tests have harm in and of itself from the screening test. For example, you gave colonoscopy and the risk of perforation of the colon, which some people put at 1 in 10,000. In this one study we'll talk about, it was 0, but that's because everyone was awake during the procedure, which might lower the risk of that, but it causes another risk of you remember what they're doing to you. So that's a risk, perforating the colon. And we've all seen the very, very rare case where that spirals downward. Yes, you perforate the colon, a lot of people get better, but every once in a while someone deteriorates from that. Every once in a while someone's going to die from that. And it's a death that wouldn't have happened otherwise. It's very rare, nothing to worry about, but it happens. You use the word false positive. I would say a different word, which is that you found something that looks like cancer. So maybe people call it a true positive, but it's not the kind of cancer you wanted to find. So it's essentially a false positive. It was a turtle. And then you're subject to a battery of treatment that often includes chemotherapy administered IV for breast cancer, or radiation administered to the prostate. And I have definitely seen patients who mammogram found a lump. They had surgery, radiation to the breast, and chemotherapy. And then 3 years later, they get leukemia, which is a known side effect of the chemotherapy they got. So it could be treatment-induced leukemia. And that's a very grave diagnosis. That person's dead. Would they have died without the mammogram? I don't know. But that chain of events was started by screening. And if that was a turtle, maybe you shortened their life. I've also seen cases where you screened someone for prostate cancer and then you radiated the prostate, but now he has radiation-induced proctitis, or inflammation of the bowel in the rectum, and he has painful bloody stools, and it's lasting for month after month after month. He's suffering. Is his life extended, or is his life made miserable by this?
And of course, what we care about, at least when we're thinking about it somewhat rationally, is how many of those are there versus how many of the outcomes where we save someone's life. I don't think I've ever met anyone who, I'll say more in a positive way, people I've met who've screened, discovered something, and were treated will always say that the screening saved their life. I can think of 3 personal friends of mine who believe that. I'm an economist. I usually smile and say, I'm so happy you're with us. But in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, you don't know that. And what we're going to talk about, really, we will, listeners. We're going to talk about the fact that when you have a large group of people, you can get a measure of how frequent these kind of events are and get a much better idea of whether the screening saves your life. Say something, though, before we move to the actual data. Say something about the financial incentives.
Yeah, no, and those two things go hand in hand. I think when you talk about the incentives for screening, it's both of the things you mentioned, the financial and the psychological. So, of course, everybody who's had a lump found from mammography, and most people who've had a lump, who've had a prostate cancer found or a polyp clipped, they feel like they benefit, even if they've suffered some complication. Even if they've had to go through an arduous treatment, they still feel like, wow, were it not for that screening test, I wouldn't be here today. But as you point out, Russ, they don't know that to be true. They don't know their individual counterfactual. Unfortunately, the only way to know that is randomized data with lots of people so we can actually start to count and tally these things up, which thankfully we do have some. So, but that psychological drive is so powerful that if you think you benefit, of course, you don't want to hear anyone criticizing that test. And I hear that a lot. The second thing is the financial part. Cancer screening turns a lot of healthy people into patients. That makes a lot of money for the whole system. In fact, some of these juggernauts of screening campaigns, they massively enrich hospitals and providers and practitioners. Everyone is sensitive to that because nobody sets out to be a gastroenterologist just because they are greedy. That's not true at all. I mean, they're good people who want to do good, but they have to acknowledge that a huge chunk of that specialty is the revenue that comes from that screening colonoscopy. And so when that revenue is threatened, as in the recent trial called Nordic, which failed to find a benefit on colorectal cancer mortality, a lot of people are going to be very defensive. And it feels a lot to me, Russ, like motivated reasoning. After the fact, they say this study is wrong. Well, of course, you do it every day. It paid for your beach house, and you feel like it's doing good. And so, of course, it's hard for you to consider that maybe it's not. And Russ, the thing I always tell people is, for a doctor, the methamphetamine of being a doctor, the most addictive thing in our minds is you do something that you really think benefits your patient and you get a little financial bonus for that at the end of the month. And that combination of money plus you're doing the right thing, that's the methamphetamine of being a doctor. And so those things are super addictive and we get addicted to them. And it's very hard for us to think clearly about those substances and procedures.
Yeah. We've talked about this on the program before, that in these kind of complicated situations where there's uncertainty and a financial stake, it's often helpful to ask the doctor, let's say you're helping your mother or dealing with some health crisis. You say to the doctor, well, if this was your mother, what would you do? Sort of forcing, obviously it's not his mother, so he probably can evade that technique if he wants to, but I think it has a psychological effect on the doctor. But of course, if you're doing these procedures, you've probably convinced yourself. It's in the case of economic regulation, it's called cognitive capture. The idea that you advocate for a regulation that benefits you because you could talk yourself into it. Exactly what you were referring to. So I would think especially in the case of practitioners who benefit from these procedures, it must be extremely hard for them to step back from their own stake in the matter and try to give you a measured piece of advice.
Absolutely. And the last thing I'd say on this topic, Russ, is, because I think that's really well put, is that, you can be a great gastroenterologist, you can be a great urologist, you can be a great cancer doctor and not have spent a lot of time thinking about cancer screening, which is a program run at a population level that exploits different principles of epidemiology and is really something different than the individual doctor's experience. Sometimes people tell me, well, I've seen the person it cured, and it's the same fallacy that you made, right? You didn't. You don't know what would have happened to them. And the only way to really know this is to look at large population studies and to put your economist hat on, to put your epidemiologist hat on. And I think that's something that unfortunately doctors are not trained in. So that's yet another bias. So you have everyone says it does good, the financial bias, and then I'm not really trained to read these studies bias.
Yeah, I'm just going to add one of my favorite insights from Nassim Taleb, which is you don't ask the carpenter who built the roulette wheel how to play roulette, because might be the world's best carpenter, might be the most beautiful and balanced roulette wheel and fair, but the carpenter might not know very much about statistics, and it's a separate thing. And so I think a lot of people trust their doctors because they assume they're the expert, but they are the expert in certain pieces of the experience, but not all of them. And many of them are not trained in risk analysis.
Absolutely right. And the one I use is that you don't ask the guy who tears your ticket at the movie theater what project you should produce in the next movie cycle. Just because they have, but I like your example better. I like Taleb's.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about the data, which is somewhat sobering. Not somewhat. It's extremely sobering. There is normally there's a bias in empirical work toward finding something. Finding nothing is usually not the road to getting a paper published. No one wants to find out about things that don't work. But in medicine, fortunately, a lot of people have taken serious looks to see if something actually works. And when they find nothing, it's very publishable, unlike other interventions. So in this case, it's a pretty bleak story. So you could try to summarize it. I mean, the main thing I think to focus on for listeners who haven't consumed these studies in any detail is to emphasize the point about all death mortality, because that is not the first thing you'd think about unless you're an economist, to be honest.
Yeah. So do you want to do it cancer by cancer, or do you want to do it like a summary of the whole space? How should I get into it?
We can go cancer by cancer. I'd say we should do a few of the more common ones where, colonoscopy, mammogram. The PSA used to be one that I think people have moved away from for prostate cancer, but we can start with those two, colonoscopy and mammograms.
Yeah, so I guess we could start with mammography. Mammographic screening developed now about half century ago, and the idea is simple: that if a woman has a yearly breast radiograph, we'll be able to find cancer and maybe cut it out earlier than before she even feels a lump, which is hopefully before it spreads. And all these, so that's the idea. We've had at least 7 large randomized controlled trials of mammographic screening, different age groups. We've gone, down to, I think, 39 years old, all the way up into 69 years old. There are differing recommendations for women between the ages of 40 and 50 and above. There's a lot of debate on what's the upper bound age. Should you stop at 75 or 70, or should you stop at 80 or something like that? People have different feelings there. At some point, we're sort of outside of the randomized evidence. What does the randomized evidence generally show? There's 2 things they look at. One is you randomize tens of thousands of women to annual screening or biannual screening or something like that, using the best screening machines of the time. And then tens of thousands of women are randomized to the control arm of no recommended annual screening. You follow them for years. And then the 2 things they look at is how many women died of breast cancer and how many women died for any reason. Okay, that's the death from all cause. I have been a big proponent in my career that we really need to be looking at that all cause death. And for some of the reasons you described, Russ, which was that what if you got the mammogram, you found a turtle, you got treated for the turtle, you got chemotherapy, and you had a leukemia 2 years later, and died from that? Well, you want to penalize the screening arm for that harm, if it was in fact related. You wouldn't do that if the only endpoint you were looking at is dying from breast cancer. You might miss this leukemia diagnosis and think it's unrelated. This is called the slippery linkage bias. It slips out of the link, slips away. The other reason I like looking at all-cause death is ultimately it's what patients care about. People say, yeah. You want to say something on that? Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's the only thing we care about, really. But I wanted to say one thing about the leukemia. Of course, we don't fully understand always what the side effects of various diagnoses diagnostic techniques and treatments are. So, in your talk on this, we'll link to you have a wonderful YouTube summarizing the mammography data. You mentioned about, well, you wouldn't expect it to do X, but of course we don't really know that. So living under a diagnosis, say, of cancer might stress your heart in ways that we don't fully understand. The stress of that, the emotional pain. So I just think it's really important. Important is not the right word. You have to look at all-cause mortality if you have any confidence in the fact that you have a randomized trial.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that. And I'll give you a piece of data to bolster your argument, which is that there are studies that show that in the immediate aftermath of a prostate cancer diagnosis for men, there's a slight increase in suicide. Imagine that suicide, if it's attributable to being told you have prostate cancer, even if it's a very, very small increase, that should be a penalty that the screening test, those are deaths that wouldn't have occurred if you didn't tell the man that. Okay, so it should look at all-cause mortality, in my opinion. If you look at all-cause mortality in all of the mammographic screening trials put together, you will find there's just no signal there. It's just not budging all-cause mortality. It looks pretty null. Confidence intervals cross 1. The actual effect size is like 0.99. It's as close to just totally null as it gets. Now, proponents of mammography say, well, that's unfair. You don't have the power to find a difference. There could be a difference that exists. The studies just aren't designed and sized for that. And in fact, we've done some power calculations. I had a paper on it a few years ago. You'd probably need like 3 million women randomized, and they're usually in the tens of thousands. Put together, maybe it's like 300,000, 400,000 women. You need 3 million. But the point I want to make is, if you need 3 million women randomized to see the effect, maybe it's a small effect. Maybe it's something that might not be worth $100 billion medical campaign. That's something that, we could think about. The next thing I'd say is, if you look at just the reduction in death from breast cancer, I always like to separate the trials into this thing you've alluded to, which is what we call adequately randomized or suboptimally randomized studies. This is not my nomenclature. This comes from the Cochrane Group, that is the independent research group looking at the studies. And it's exactly as you say. They look for some endpoints that they think are implausibly related to screening. So they look at dying for something other than breast cancer. And if there's severe imbalances between the two groups, they think there's something a little bit odd about randomization. And in fact, that's true for some of the very older studies. And I guess listeners may not know this, but in the history of medicine, the first randomized controlled trials came out in the 1940s. And now in 2023, it's a juggernaut of randomized studies. We're putting out maybe tens of thousands of maybe 100,000 randomized studies a year. It's just a machine. We've gotten a lot better at randomization. We used to have envelopes, that you would randomize people and open the envelope. Sometimes people would hold them up to the light to try to, subvert randomization. Now we have computer generated automatic telephone randomization. Pretty much everything about the design and conduct of studies is better today than it was, when many of these trials were run, these mammographic screening trials were run. Many of them use things like a mailer. So people are invited by mailed invitation to participate in the program. There can be some biases because the group of people who didn't show up, but the group of people who was assigned to the control arm may include some people who are already deceased, for instance. And that's been cited as a problem with some of these older studies. This is a little bit long-winded, and so I'll just cut to the point. The point is that even the biggest optimist about mammographic screening would probably cite a 20% reduction in dying from breast cancer. They can't claim a reduction in dying for any reason. And that means 80% of breast cancer deaths are not avoided. And this is largely using studies that happened decades ago. And probably a lot of the changes in breast cancer treatment have eroded that benefit. I think that's what proponents would say. A critic like me would say is that I truly have no idea if I advise a woman to undergo this screening test, if she's going to live longer. I just don't know. And I don't know if she's going to live better. And I have to ask myself, what are we doing as a profession that we cannot answer that most basic question?
So you say you just don't know. Isn't it a little stronger? Isn't it? As far as we know, there's no effect. It's not, we don't know if it works or not. We're saying with the evidence that we have, it doesn't work. it does not extend the lives of the average person. Again, there may be many categories of people who should screen, and it will be have a positive impact on longevity. But for the average person, there's no evidence that it works.
That's how I would put it. I'd say there's no, I mean, this is where the statisticians quibble about the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence sort of thing. But I would say that, look, there's a conventional burden in medicine, which is if you do something for 50 years, you got to prove it works, and you never proved it. You take all the trials, you put them together, there's no all-cause mortality benefit. Yes, maybe they're underpowered. Maybe you need to run 3 million person randomized studies. But until you do so, maybe you're the one who should cool your rhetoric. You don't have evidence that you live longer or live better from doing this. And I also think, more to point, that if you told someone doing this, what I'm saying right now, that actually if you pool all the studies, there's no evidence women live longer, would they really want to do it? And the answer is, we don't know, because that's not how we counsel people. Too many women have mammograms because the doctor says, all right, now, how are you doing, Susie? Okay, last thing, before you go, we're going to schedule your mammogram. You turned 40, so we're just going to go ahead and schedule that. So you can schedule that at the front desk on your way out. Have a great day. That's the consent, you know? That's so inadequate. Moreover, a lot of hospitals, they incentivize the doctor. If they have 85% of women in the target age group getting mammograms, they get their yearly bonus. And if it's 82%, they don't. And so they're incentivizing people. Yeah.
How big is that bonus?
I would say that it varies by institution or program, but I've heard that it can be as much as, 10 to 15% your salary.
It's a lot of money.
And I don't want to say it's just for mammograms. It's usually for some composite of the number of your patients who have low blood pressure adequately treated and the sugar is treated and they get the mammogram and the colonoscopy. But to me, this is one of the most gray areas of medicine, screening. It's one of the most preference sensitive areas, which we'll talk about with this gentleman. Like, different people can have different preferences. Someone's preference could be to, I don't want to do the colonoscopy and I'm willing to take a little bit of risk. That's my life, And when you start to incentivize ambiguous and preference sensitive decisions, you got a problem. These should best be tackled with shared decision making. Being totally honest with the patient, what we know, what we don't know. And I say patient, that's the wrong word, person, because this is somebody who's healthy. They're not a patient. They're a person until you make them a patient. I think, and the final thing I'll say, Russ, is in my experience, whenever I talk to people one-on-one and I tell them the way everything I've been saying so far, what we know, what we don't know, most people say, I had no idea that was the case. Nobody ever told me. And had I known that at best it's 20% reduction in breast cancer death, and there's no signal in all-cause mortality, I would never have done it. What the hell? I'm not coming in here for that triviality.
And it's a 20% reduction in a very small number.
Small number. Maybe, can I put it in perspective? So
yeah,
I think there's a graph this is coming from memory, so a listener can check me, but I think it's called The Opinion of the Swiss Medical Board, New England Journal, maybe in the last decade. And it analyzes a hypothetical cohort of 1,000 or 10,000 women undergoing screening. And the gist is that a woman undergoing screening versus not, there'll be 5 deaths from breast cancer that go down to 4 deaths from breast cancer, but there's 39 deaths from other reasons, or 39 or 40 deaths from other reasons in both groups. I say 39 or 40 because we don't know we improve all-cause mortality. And so to put that in perspective, this graphic also asks women their perception of the risk of breast cancer death and then the reality, and it shows massive differences in that perception and reality, that women think breast cancer death is a huge probability, but the reality is it's only a small fraction of death. So 5 out of 45, something in that ballpark.
And
going down to 4 out of 45, yeah.
And that's because it's relatively rare, and we have better ways of treating it, whether it's found early or late. Correct?
Yes. And so what I would say is that every single one of these mammographic randomized studies, in my opinion, likely overstates the benefit, because since those studies were conducted, the treatments have gotten so much better. And just like the testicle cancer example, as your treatment for advanced disease gets better, that differential effect that you're exploiting for screening is smaller. And I suspect that, and in fact, I've written this, or we're going to submit the paper. I think we need a new study. I mean, we need a study that's up to date with what we're doing now. And let's just talk about breast cancer. I mean, breast cancer has probably had 30 new drugs approved. Breast cancer has improvements in surgical technique. The radiation we give for breast cancer, it's a different machine. It's given better than it ever was given. Our ability to do scans and detect small breast cancer, stage people more accurately has gotten better. Supportive care has gotten better. Anti-nausea medicines have gotten better. Our drugs have gotten better. It's a different disease than it was in 1985, thankfully. And that, in my opinion, will erode whatever benefit of screening was there in a study that was finished in 1985.
That's a fantastic point. Would you tell a woman in your life who had no genetic predisposition to cancer not to get a mammogram? A woman, a loved one, a spouse, a close friend, and they come to you and they say, "This is your specialty, Vinay. What should I do?"
My answer is, of course, I like to talk to people. Because I do think, Russ, there are different types of people. There are always those people who, even if the chance that something will help them is very slight, they want to do it. They're willing to give it a shot. And there's other people who are like, look, even if skipping that morning cup of coffee would help me live an extra month, there's no way in hell I'm skipping my morning cup of coffee kind of people, But my honest answer is, there's lots of screening tests that I personally wouldn't do. And I would advise somebody I care about, you don't have to do it if you really don't want to. And mammography is one of them. We can talk about colon cancer screening, but I probably personally wouldn't do a colonoscopy. I'm not yet at the age group they want to sink their tentacles into me, but they're coming for me. They're coming for me, and I'm probably going to decline. And I'm not going to do a PSA screening personally. I'm not a smoker, so I'm not eligible for lung cancer screening. But if I were a smoker, I definitely wouldn't do lung cancer screening, which I think is extremely unfavorable. And if a loved one came to me and said, "Do I have to have my mammogram? I'm 42. I'd say absolutely not if you don't want to, and you can read the data and make your own decision. And I'd be happy to advise somebody I'm not persuaded it should have ever been a program. Now, the reason I think people are reluctant to say that is that many doctors will say that privately. But of course, people worry that if you say that publicly, that you're crossing some line. But I don't know. What is the line we're crossing? We don't believe, we've never been persuaded that it makes you live longer, live better. So of course, you wouldn't recommend it to someone you cared about because I'm not persuaded of that.
Say something about the paternalism that you've talked about.
There's an old ad by the American Cancer Society that was literally taken out in newspapers that said, if a woman hasn't had a mammogram, she needs more than her breasts examined, meaning that she's crazy. She needs her brain examined, This is the American Cancer Society. The point I want to make is that uninformative persuasion, coercion, paternalism has been the norm of cancer screening programs from the 1970s to almost the last 5 years. We have, even to the present day, we force people to do this. We do not have discussions. We just put you in the machine and the widget comes out the end. People who are listening will have gone to doctor's appointments where they walk out and the last thing it says on the paper, maybe they didn't even talk about it, is show up for a mammogram and go to the lab and get your PSA. That is paternalism. That is the doctor telling you that we need to do this, and it pretty much doesn't matter what your thoughts or preferences are on this issue. That to me is a problem. That's the root problem of cancer screening, because we could have a broader philosophical debate on paternalism. I'm something in the middle where I think there is a role for paternalism sometimes in medicine. People sometimes want you to make the decision for them, especially in tough times. That's been the case. I think sometimes people burden. Sometimes somebody has a tough situation in cancer, and I see the trainee putting everything on the family, burdening the family with a choice that the family can't make, and that we need to shoulder the burden and go in there and say, not this is a choice, but here is my recommendation as a doctor. Okay. Having said that, this is a place where I think paternalism is off the charts inappropriate, cancer screening, because it's healthy people. And the evidence is so disputed for decades by many experts in top publications that I think the only acceptable answer is some shared decision making.
I love when you said, well, it depends what kind of person they are, what their preferences are. Because there's no right answer here. it's really important in case situations of uncertainty and unpredictability. You are not the average person. No one is. You'll either get cancer that kills you or you won't when, something comes up. You'll either get a turtle or a bird or a rabbit, and you're unique. You're you. We don't really have any way to customize yet. Hopefully, we hope someday in the future, but it reminds me a little bit of the trolley problem, which we're not going to digress on it in any great length. But for those who know it already, and we may return to this in a future episode, people feel differently about things that they initiate versus things that happen to them passively. And I think one of the reasons people screen, even when it's, quote, not rational or the expected value is zero, is they want to be proactive. They don't want to have to regret later. They're afraid that if they don't screen and then they die if they get terminal cancer, they'll feel like they were foolish and they made a mistake. And I think for loved ones also, it's why I asked you. It's a personal question. If you advise your wife not to get a mammogram, you're putting yourself in a position where you might feel the rest of your life a terrible burden because you counseled something that ended up being had a bad outcome. The other kind of outcome, which is you counsel screening, and that turns out badly. I think that's easier for people to live with. All the kind of bad things that come from that, the perforated colon in the case of a colonoscopy, or the side effects of the treatment. I think a lot of people cut other people slack when those things happen because they're trying to fix it. And it's, this is last thing I'll say on this. It's an example of in economics, what we call the seen and the unseen. The direct effects of things are front of mind and at the center of our minds, and the things that are the unseen side effects tend to be minimized because you can't be blamed for them, and you don't feel like you're blameworthy unless you're an economist.
Yeah, no, I think you're really hitting on a core psychological tension here, which is that if you advise someone not to do it and anything happens, by the way, 80% of that would have happened, even according to the optimists, right? Then they're going to say, gosh, had I done it, I would have been saved. So they're going to blame you. And if you advise them to do something, no matter what bad happens, they're not going to blame you. They're going to say, at least you were trying. And I think that core imbalance is why screening thrives despite very weak evidence. I sometimes say that if screening was not, if the exact same data for mammograms and colonoscopies wasn't for screening, but for a pill, a tablet you swallow, it would never be FDA approved and no one would ever take it. Because there's something psychologically about taking a tablet every day forever, and there's no all-cause mortality. Get the hell out of here, doctor. I'm not taking that tablet. But looking, information, finding, cutting, and doing things only if you find something, well, I'm willing to do that. That's something like you're trying to do, solve the problem. But as an epidemiologist, it's a fun thought experiment. Would the FDA have approved those trial data? I think the answer is no. They wouldn't have been happy with the randomization either.
Say something about colonoscopy and colon cancer and all-cause mortality, and then we'll move on to we have a case study that's, I think, very illuminating.
Yeah, the thing I'd say about colonoscopy is that, one, we should acknowledge the United States is an outlier, that we really like colonoscopy. And the old joke is that at the end of the colon, there's a $1,000 bill that every gastroenterologist is looking to clip. And it's kind of a joke, but it's also true that it's a procedure that reimburses.
Is it only a $1,000 bill?
It's maybe $1,000 if it's Medicare and $6,000 if it's a private insurer. I mean, it can be hefty. It can be hefty reimbursement. What I would say about colon cancer screening is that until this last year, there were 0 randomized studies of colonoscopy, and many European nations did not recommend colonoscopy as that was the intervention that went beyond available data. The U.S. has been doing colonoscopy for a long time, based largely on some of the other considerations we'll talk about, and our financial biases, but other nations weren't. So what was the data? The original colon cancer screening was something called fecal occult blood test, or FOBT. It's basically smearing feces on a card and looking for occult blood, little bits of blood in it that you didn't feel or see. And that was the original test. And that has multiple randomized trials that show a reduction in dying from colon cancer. So you're less likely to die of colon cancer. But you're no less likely to die for any reason. the Minnesota FOBT study has absolutely superimposable survival curves for all-cause mortality. You look like you did the same. We switched maybe about a decade and a half ago to the fecal immunohistochemical test, or FIT. That's a different kind of card technique that you poop on a card. It looks for different things, but it has slightly better test characteristics. It's a little more sensitive and a little more specific. And so people can say it's a reasonable extrapolation to use the FIT card versus the FOBT. And I'm okay with that too. We do have randomized trials of sigmoidoscopy. What's a sigmoidoscope? Sigmoidoscope is a way to screen the left side of the colon. It's a shorter scope. It doesn't go all the way in. The GI doctors will tell you that screening the left side and not the right side is like getting a mammogram on just the left breast, not the right breast. But there are a lot of reasons why that's a false analogy, because the left side of the colon is different than the right side. The stool is more solid, and the cancers that occur there have different mutations and fundamentally do differently with treatment. And because of those differences, some of us believe that sigmoidoscopy actually does work. And in fact, sigmoidoscopy has a reduction in colon cancer death. And if you do a meta-analysis of all the studies, there is a small reduction in all-cause death. So sigmoidoscopy has cleared the highest bar. That might be the only thing I consider doing for myself. Colonoscopy has always been thought to be, it's at least a sigmoidoscopy. At least we look that far, and then we look a little bit further. So it has to be at least as good. That's the logic. But the recent Nordic study found that it's still early, so it may find a benefit with time. But so far, it's failed to find a reduction in colorectal cancer death from colonoscopy. This is a study that came out of Europe, Norway, in multiple European countries like Norway, Sweden, and Poland. One thing I should say, Russ, critics of this study the economists say, only 40% of the people assigned to colonoscopy actually did it. So this is not a trial of 100% versus 0%. It's 40% versus 0%. Okay, but if you do an instrumental variable analysis, which you'll know well, and you adjust for that, it still is not significant, even adjusting for 100% compliance using IV methods. If you use a different type of methodology that they favor, which is not as good as instrumental variables, then they think it is significant, which I disagree with. But anyway, that's an aside. The long story short is the benefits we're talking about, the upper bound benefits are small. Colonoscopy has weaker evidence than this FlexSig, and FlexSig is done more in Europe, in part because it's way cheaper to do and it's easier to do. You don't have to drink that whole bottle of liquid the night before, et cetera.
I feel pretty confident, Vinay, that if the 40% was the rate at which people followed through and actually got the colonoscopy, that FIT card has a slightly lower percentage. I've been in, it's more than once, a doctor's handed me that kit and said, so just go home. And I thought, no, not happening. And I have a feeling I'm not alone.
Yeah. And I think they're both questions are important. One is the real world compliance being poor. In the United States, some studies say it's as high as 50, 60%. So, put that with a grain of salt. In Nordic, in one of the countries, it was as high as 60%, and they also failed to find a benefit. So maybe that's more emblematic of the US experience. But one thing to say is, if the compliance is very low, maybe we shouldn't be paying for it at a population level. The second thing to say is that for somebody who does comply, do they benefit? And that's a separate question, but that's where the instrumental variable analysis will get you. And even that failed in Nordic. So I think that's the thing people don't see. And by the way, it's in the supplement for people who are looking.
Let's close with an example you wrote about, which is quite powerful, tragic. It's an N of 1, but it's an illustrative N of 1, a single sample point, a single data point, of a 74-year-old chain smoker who and his lung cancer. And you write about it on your Substack, which is called?
This is on Sensible Medicine, which is a Substack I run with some colleagues, but I also have my own Vinay Prasad's observations and thoughts.
Okay, so we'll link to both of those. We'll link to both of those. Tell the story.
So this was, I call him the most improbable 74-year-old man. I remember him vividly. This was quite some time ago. This was one of those gentlemen who was not just thin, he was rail thin. I mean, he was a heavy smoker, mechanic, rail thin guy. He was so thin, you put your hand on his back, you'd feel his spine, his scapula, you feel every rib. I mean, he's that kind of thin guy. He had been working as, he's a retired guy. He lives, outside of the city. He works on cars in his garage. He's not married. He's got no kids. He's got no one in his life that, he's tied to. He's kind of a loner. And he goes under those cars and he smokes cigarettes and he works on the cars. And now, before some listeners are going to say that's the fire hazard or something.
Well, he smokes a lot of cigarettes. You should say how many.
He smokes 4 packs a day. He smoked 4 packs a day since he was a teenager. He's 74. His pack year history is in the hundreds and hundreds of pack years. This is an extraordinary smoking history. When you talk to him about smoking, his view on smoking is, I'm sure it's not good for me, but at this point, I'm not going to stop. I mean, I've enjoyed it my whole life. I'm going to keep enjoying it. And he also has a different view on life than I think a lot of people, where he's not in the life maximization business. He tells me many times, I just want to work on my car and I want to have the pleasure of having some cigarettes. That's it. I don't have a grand ambition here. I'm 74. I live by myself. As long as I'm capable, I want to work on my car. The story gets a little bit complicated because we start to debut, by we, I mean the hospital, a lung cancer screening program. And this guy comes into a doctor's appointment and they say, oh, you're old enough for your colonoscopy and your CT scan for your lungs to look for lung cancer. He learns what a colonoscopy is and he tells him to go to hell. He's not going to do that. No way you're putting a camera there, and there's no way I'm drinking that. He says a CT scan, that's non-invasive. I guess I'll do that. He gets the CT scan. And lo and behold, they find tons of spots in the lungs. I mean, I think what the listeners may not know is sometimes you take somebody who's a heavy smoker, you do a CT scan in the lungs, you find many, many things you're worried about. But then you're in a dilemma, Russ, which is that you can't do a biopsy of every single one. There's just so many things to go after. So what we do is we have these interdisciplinary meetings. We look at the scan. We follow them over time. We pick the ones that are growing the fastest or look the most concerning. We biopsy those. We do it sort of step by step. And lo and behold, I'll simplify the story. Listeners can read it. He has 1 lung cancer. We cut it out. He gets radiation. He gets chemotherapy. They follow him a few more years. He has another lung cancer. They give him some radiation. They follow him out a few years. And I think, he gets to like a 3rd lung cancer and they're talking about giving him chemo again. And I start to think, what the hell are we doing to this guy? He's getting surgery, radiation, chemotherapy. By the way, there's not so much data to give chemotherapy twice. I mean, I think the fact that lung cancer is growing despite prior chemotherapy should give you some pause. And then the question is, the patient says to me, quote, I was fine before that scan. I never felt bad a day in my life except for what the doctors did to me. And he said this, what do I know about lung cancer screening? They just told me where to show up for this scan. I assumed they knew what they were doing. I never felt bad until they started on me. And he says, I don't care how long I live. I just want to spend time doing what I want to do. And to me, I sometimes ask myself, what are we doing in medicine? We plucked this guy from his garage where he was happily smoking 4 packs a day. He says he doesn't want to live. He doesn't want to maximize his survival. We subject him to CT scans, which tie him to our system. He's got to come every 3 months for more and more scans, sometimes CT, sometimes PET CT. Sometimes we do endobronchial ultrasound and biopsy. Sometimes we do a wedge resection with a video assisted surgery. We're doing radiotherapy. We're giving him chemotherapy. And at the end of the day, if you put a gun to my head, Russ, and you say, would he have been dead if you didn't do any of this? I don't know. I just don't know if we've extended his life. I really don't know the answer. And the lung cancer screening trials, they are pretty negative in my opinion. And so I start to ask myself, what are we doing in medicine? Why are we going after somebody who didn't even want our help and felt fine? And we made him a patient.
Yeah, and if you did extend his life, that's his choice, as you point out in the essay. It should be his choice. It's tough. It's tough, and I assume he's a Medicare patient.
Yes, he's definitely Medicare, and I think he also has some private insurance. So he's helping our coffers. I mean, I guess it's sort of a philosophical question about what do we want as we age? And, Zeke Emanuel, of course, he had the Atlantic essay a few years ago where he said, after the age of 75, I'm not going to do anything that modern medicine offers me. And he got a big backlash. I think his essay was kind of often misunderstood because I think many people read it as Zeke Emanuel, architect of Obamacare, the guy who wants the death panel. Of course, he doesn't want care for older people. I didn't read it that way. I read it as a personal, having been in medicine for so many years, knowing that everything we do cuts both ways. I'm happy to say that I'd rather err on the side of missing out on something than all the iatrogenic harms that come from treatment. That's how I read his essay. I'm not exactly where Zeke is. There are lots of things I would do when I'm 80. There are lots of procedures I think are remarkable, like opening up a narrow aortic valve, or some treatment that has very little toxicity that it can extend my quality of life. So there are lots of things I would do. But screening for cancer, if I'm a 200 pack year lung cancer, 200 pack year smoker, I wouldn't do that. And I feel a lot of sympathy for this patient. And then the last thing I'd add is, I'm not sure, did he have a choice? The way it was he saw the doctor and the doctor just recommended these things. The colonoscopy obviously scared him away because it sounds like something that some people may not want. But this, maybe he was deceived into doing, because it's just a scan. It feels like it's not going to hurt you. But lo and behold, 2 years, 3 years later, he's had multiple procedures, many biopsies, and undergone radiation and chemotherapy. And so that's not good. That takes something out of you.
I would just add, in a reference to the recent episode with Lydia Dugdale about dying, that there's a quality of life issue here for all of us, that we have to make our own decisions, or we'd like to make our own decisions, or I think we should probably have the chance to make our own decisions about the risks we want to take at various times in our life and what might come of those decisions that we make. In this case, it didn't turn out that way, but it could have been that this would have extended his life, and maybe it will. By the way, we don't know that either.
Maybe it did, yeah.
But it's his call. I like the idea that it's his call. So just again, to make sure that no one misunderstands what you're saying, either in this case or the previous conversations we had, if you don't screen, many people, if we got rid of all these tests, if there was a revolution in the medical profession that said, this is embarrassing, these tests are self-serving, there's no evidence that they extend the lives of our patients or the people we're supposed to serve, we're going to get rid of them. People are still going to get cancer. It's just that the awareness of that cancer will be, there'll still be screening. It just won't be done with the kind of tests we use. You'll have pain, you'll have blood in your urine, you'll have headaches. Things will happen that alert you to something being wrong in your body, but not sooner than that. And you're not suggesting in any way, as I understand it, that you should ignore those. You're just saying that the impulse to find things earlier and smaller, which has a certain appeal, akin to you should get a full body scan every 6 weeks, because that way, if there's anything growing inside you that shouldn't be, you'll be able to find it sooner than later. That's what you are questioning.
That's absolutely right. I mean, if you feel any symptom, unwell, blood in the stool, difficulty urinating, cough, chest pain, you need to seek medical care. It could be cancer, it could be something else. But that's, of course you need to see the doctor for that. And no one would advocate otherwise. Cancer screening programs, I'm not sure if I had a magic wand, I'm not sure my magic wand would say, just get rid of them. I'm not sure that's what I would do with my magic wand. My magic wand would say that these have all been developed in a world where we were fighting the quote unquote war on cancer, going back to Nixon's war on cancer. They all developed in a world where our drugs were impotent, our treatments were harmful, catastrophic. And the idea that if you were only to find it early and cut it out, you would spare someone so much misery down the road was an extremely seductive idea. Most of them were debuted with very, very weak evidence or no evidence. The evidence that's accumulated over the last few decades has been I'd say, undermining, negative, or further makes it seem like it's not doing exactly what we hoped. People are not having informed discussions. We're not giving people the freedom to say no. And so if I could wave the magic wand, the first thing that would happen is that everybody undergoing any screening test has the opportunity to talk to somebody who knows a lot about the screening test. And one option from that conversation is that if you decide, knowing everything, you don't want to do it, that's an okay option. And nobody's salary is getting docked. So nobody's being incentivized to twist your arm. You have a free choice. So that's my first magic wand. Give people free choice with the data we have. And then the second thing is that the only way to settle this is the bigger studies. I've rewritten about that in BMJ a few years ago and keep writing about it, which is that as a society, even though it's really expensive to randomize 3 million women to mammography or not, even though that's a really expensive task, if we don't do it in 20 years from now, we are going to be in the same situation we are now and 20 years ago, which is just circumstantial evidence, different people's views of it, and then this heated debate. And ultimately, it's a good question, which is, if you take a healthy person, are there things you can look for and find early to improve their outcome? And the last thing I'd say is, there are companies like Grail that have multiple billion-dollar evaluations that are making what they call the Holy Grail, a blood test that you can draw that will look for many, many cancers all at once. And it's extremely seductive that I'll get a blood test and it could say, you might have pancreas cancer or bladder cancer. And now we can focus our efforts on looking for it. And in my mind, the only way that test should be used broadly is a large randomized study showing people who get that test done, they live longer for any reason than people who don't get that test done. But of course, the company that makes that test, they do not want that to be the bar. They want a lower standard of evidence to sell their test. Of course they do, because there's so much money to be had. And everybody in Silicon Valley, not everybody, but many people they fall prey to the idea that information is always good and that the body is like a computer and we can, understand it at the root parts. But to me, the body is marvelously more complicated than any machine. You can't understand it fully in the root parts. You can't build it from scratch the way you can build a computer or a car. You can't tear it down to the studs and build it back again. And we should have some humility to recognize that maybe the thing we're doing to extend survival is not actually working. How would we even know that? How would we detect that? But we ought to consider that as a possibility. And I think especially before we debut tests like Grail on the population.
My guest today has been Vinay Prasad. Vinay, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thank you, Russ.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.